Hi, welcome to the first mix breakdown video for the Duality Shadow Moses mashup that I did. I just want to put a quick little disclaimer here. Everything we're hearing for the first 80% of the video is running through my drum processing chain, which is going to be explained in full here, right here where this timestamp is. That's just so that you know. If you want to go along with me for whatever reason, I would do this first and then go back through everything. Everything should still make sense either way. You can watch this thing front to back. It's normal mixing stuff, but just for the sake of full disclosure, I am running my full drum bus processing throughout basically the whole video on top of all the other stuff that we're hearing. That's enough from me. Let's get into it. I'm showing you drums today. I thought about how to make this digestible in a way that just wouldn't be a mess of too much information all at once. And I figured the best way to do that is to just walk you through in the order that I actually created this thing. So the way my process works is I'll do the drums until I'm happy with them, bounce them to a stereo stem file, do the guitars and bass, bounce those down, and then do a vocal session in which I do the final mix. So this is my drum session from where I did the drums. So what we're looking at here is the Get Good Drums Modern and Massive kit. This is what I use for everything. However, I use different pieces than I usually use. So if you've seen my Bezos 1 mixdown video, this is a different-ish kit than I believe I was using back then. So usually I use the Gretsch brass, either normal or high tuned. For this song, I used the Ludwig Superphonic COB brass. So just a different snare than I usually use. We've got the 15-inch Meinl Byzance traditional hats. I used to use the 14-inch MB20 sound waves. These days I'm preferring the 15-inch hat. I think these are even different crashes than I usually use. We've got the 18-inch left crash, the 20 medium heavy right crash. We've got the Byzance heavy traditional ride. Got the Guru Paduak 12 by 8-inch rack, recording custom Birch 16 floor, recording custom Birch 18 floor, and then the recording custom Birch 26 inch kick drum. So that's the kit. I'll play you sort of what it sounds like at the moment. This is raw. It's being processed through Modern and Massive, and I'll walk you through each screen of my settings as well while I let the drums just kind of play. So not huge or exciting, just decent starter drum sounds. This is our kick. So what we're hearing here is the kick sum and kick sub tracks within Modern and Massive. So this is the normal kick. And then this is the sub track. Very subby. And then together, they sound like that. So this is sort of the balance I have going on. A lot of direct mics, not a lot in the rooms and overheads. Not turned way down, but not a lot. I've got the turbo up around halfway across all the tracks. For the snare, I've got the turbo cranked, and what turbo is in Modern and Massive is basically a pre-processed, a preset basically, that Get Good Drums decided this is how drums should sound when they're fully mixed. So I do some mixing within Get Good Drums, and then I multi out the tracks so that we can fine tune it further from there. So this snare is not the biggest sounding snare in the world. Let's just get this window out of here. We can listen to the snare. Here's the top mic. And the bottom mic. Not the most exciting sound, but I will get you to that finished massive Bring Me the Horizon snare sound. The toms are pretty bare bones. All I've done to the direct mics on the toms is gated them. So it goes from this to this. That's it. I'm just killing some of the ring because it was a little excessive for such a dense mix. But I mean, that's really it. They sound like toms. Like there's not much to say there. I've summed the cymbals together into one group here. Oh, I suppose I should show you the settings in Get Good for the tom. So as you can see here, a lot of room far on the snare, decent amount of overheads, but not a lot of bottom, room mono, or large diaphragm overhead. On the toms, it's got the close mics pinned, and then a lot of room, a lot of overhead. I just wanted the toms to be really big and full, and nothing says big and full, quite like cranking the faders all the way up. So I did that, and then I turned the turbo up about 3/4 of the way. And the cymbals are pretty simple. I turned the turbo up about halfway, except for the ride. I explicitly cranked it to get rid of as much mud in it as possible, because I found that the turbo for the cymbals, whatever it's doing, it's scooping out some of the mids. So yeah, we've got it more or less even across, except a lot in the overheads, which makes sense because it's cymbals. So the cymbals by themselves sound like this. And then the hi-hats, soloed, muted. So I would say the hats are about 50-50 close mic to overhead ratio. The rest of the kit's getting pretty cleanly captured and evenly captured by the overheads, with the exception of the ride. Which is quite present in the close mic as well. And then this is what the raw rooms sound like. Big, splashy snare, washy cymbals, the toms are pretty big and thumpy. The kick isn't super present. So those are our raw tones. That's where we're starting. And then later in the video, I'll show you all the sampling that I've done. But first, let's process this kit. We're going to start with the kick drum. So the kick drums I have bussed together into one folder just called kick, and I process them together. So you've got the kick in and the kick sub mics working in tandem into all of these plugins I'm about to show you. The very first thing I did is I cut some of the mids, and then I also turned the gain down by 3 decibels. I just realized at this point in my process that I had the kick a little bit too loud. Like if you listen to it without this, that is all kick drum, and Bring Me the Horizon mixes are way more snare oriented. So I scooped some mids and I turned it down 3 decibels, which brought us to here. A lot more manageable, a lot more realistic sounding. So that was step 1. Step 2 for the kick was to take CQ, I don't know what it's pronounced like, by Sound Toys. And I got a little bit aggressive with this one. I boosted about 1.5 decibels of lows, 6 decibels of mids at 1K for some smack, and then 3 decibels of high to give it that signature metallic sort of click sound, and then I turned the whole thing down another 3 decibels, kind of even out the fact that I was just boosting the whole time. This kind of kept the volumes relatively even, because I liked where I had it when I turned it down the 3 decibels in the Reaper EQ. So this is before the Psy EQ. It's just slightly tighter and clickier. Very subtle. Let's do it soloed so you can really hear what's going on. And with it. It's a little more obvious that way. From there, I've got FabFilter Saturn II. I am leaving the low end alone. As you can see, the drive is all the way down. I'm running it in warm tape mode across all 3 bands. So the first band is from 0 to about 410 hertz, doing nothing. Then I'm driving the mids about halfway up, and so that's from about 410 to 1200, and then the high end I'm driving a little bit harder to get even more of that sort of driven click sound. So here is the kick drum without Saturn. So you can hear that immediate presence boost that it's getting. It's not a high-end boost traditionally the way an EQ would do it. I'm just saturating the mids and the highs to sort of create frequencies that weren't there in the raw sound. And what happens when you're boosting just a ton of high end with an EQ, it can get brittle and harsh sounding. I find these days I'm having a good time saturating the high end to sort of extend the presence of the existing frequencies forward, because saturation creates new frequencies above what is currently there. So instead of what's there being louder, we're just creating more high frequencies than what we had before. Like if we like really crank it up, doesn't sound great, but we've just created, you know, a whole bunch of new frequencies. So yeah, that's what I'm doing there. And then to counteract, because I have effectively, the first move was to cut some mids, which has the net effect of boosting the lows and highs. I've boosted the mids and highs quite a bit with Psy EQ as well. And then in FabFilter, I've saturated those mids and highs. So just to be safe and make sure I'm not totally toasting the kick drum, I've added Soothe. So here's without it. It's just tidying it up a little bit, making sure that those sort of like that dark blue dipping down area, that is Soothe dynamically reacting to what you're inputting to sort of smooth out the frequency spectrum. So where any sort of buildups and peaks that might be a little resonant in the high end, it smooth that out. So we've got sort of a broad, higher frequency smack rather than a bunch of little peaks. So if we really crank Soothe up, all that high-end definition is gone. I don't want it gone. I want it tamed. And that's around where I liked it. I usually run the sharpness and selectivity at 6.9, both of them, because it's funny and for no other reason. But I mean, it also happens to sound good, so it's win-win. After Soothe, I'm running virtual channel on the Brit N, which is like a Neve console channel strip kind of setting. It's not necessarily EQing or compressing, but it is saturating it a little bit, and it does have a little bit of a low-end boost to it. So I really like putting this on everything because I'm a low-end junkie. I like mixing metal like it's hip-hop. I've been sort of reining that back a little bit, so I don't boost a lot of lows like I used to. However, I do still like running Brit N because it adds a roundness to the bottom that I really like. On top of that, I'm adding 3 decibels. It's a high shelf boost on the SSL EQ at 7.5 kilohertz. And then because I'm boosting the low end by a bit, because the Brit N on the VCC channel does have a low end boost, and then I'm also boosting the high end on the SSL EQ after the fact, I just turned the whole thing down 3 decibels to more or less even out what I had done. So here is before and after virtual mix rack. As you can see, every step of the way, if I bypass the entire kick chain, Everything I've been doing so far has just been reining in and tightening the kick drum and deciding where exactly I want the frequency distribution to sit. I didn't want the kick drum to overpower the mix the way a lot of my other mixes do, because I was going for, you know, more of the Bring Me the Horizon snare focused sound. So bringing the kick back, but making sure it still poked through in the high end was really my entire priority. I wasn't thinking too much about the lows and the mids. It's a kick drum, so the lows are gonna be there as long as you don't actively cut them out. And I mean, mids are naturally getting scooped throughout the process, at least the lower mids from 300 to 500 hertz. I'm kind of boosting the whole way through everywhere except that 300 to 500 hertz range. And then these next two plugins are working in tandem. So I'm gonna cover them both at the same time. I'll show you why first with the compressor. So it's the CLA 1176, driving it in about 30, hitting it around 18 on the output. We've got one of the slower attack settings it has. It goes faster as you turn the number up. So I've got it on 2 and then pretty much instant release. So what that's gonna do is allow the initial attack of the kick to poke through and then immediately release it. So you're getting the transient nice and clear. The compressor ducks the volume down for, you know, maybe 20 milliseconds, 50 milliseconds. We're talking almost imperceptible amounts of time just to give the attack of the kick more presence without really compressing the kick in a more traditional volume squashing sense. So here is the compressor without it. So you'll notice everything got tighter and more present. However, the low end, because we had the fast release, it was letting go immediately and letting the sustain of the kick jump through. And I had put in a lot of work on the front end of our chain to not have the low end super present on the kick drum. So that's why before the compressor, I decided to do this low shelf cut 2 decibels at 136. Those two moves together, let's listen through again. So this is without those two. With those two. So the overall balance is more or less the same. The kick is just more aggressive sounding without a discernible frequency balance change, at least to my ears. So this EQ move, again, served to negate the perceived low-end boost that the compressor was giving it. And then just to make sure that nothing was poking through too much, I ran Event Horizon, my favorite plugin in the world. It's just a clipper. It clips. It prevents sound from going louder than what you set the threshold to be, but it doesn't mangle it the way a limiter might. Limiters you can usually hear working. Clippers, you either don't hear working or you do hear it because you drove it too hard and it's literally distorting. I didn't want that, so this is very subtle. You know, kicks routinely hitting around 8 decibels, occasionally going up to -7, 6.7, but largely it's around -8 decibels. So I used Event Horizon Clipper just to keep it at literally, exactly, consistently -8 decibels. Now, obviously, drums don't exist in a vacuum. I am mixing a kick drum, which means putting it in with other components. So with that in mind, let's throw in the other instrumental stems. I'm going to bypass the kick drum processing that we've done, and then I'm going to turn it on and off and on and off while we listen through so that you can hear what I've done to it, and I'll talk through the philosophy of overall the kick drum, what I was going for. Here we go. All right, so you'll notice I was nuking the low end away and putting all the focus on the high end. I figured this song is so big sounding. Just through its arrangement already, you've got bass and guitars tuned to drop A sharp. You don't need a ton of low end in the kick because there's so many low frequencies already in the bass, already even in the guitars to some extent. The focus for me on the kick drum was making sure the high end was cutting through that dense wall of sound. And like I said earlier, the low end's gonna be there because it is a kick drum at the end of the day. I only cut low end from it once. It was only 2 decibels. And if you recall, even earlier in the chain, I had boosted about 2 or 3 decibels of low end. So really, it was just sculpting the low end. The low end boost on the Psy EQ was focused on a more low frequency, around 80 hertz. The cut that I did with the shelf is around 130 hertz. So I was just sculpting the low mids a little bit with that move. I wasn't really cutting the lows necessarily. It was just turning the kick down so it's manageable and making sure the high end was cutting through. And that's it. That's the kick drum. I'm going to restart my camera because I've been talking for half an hour. Oh my God. And then we'll start on the snare drum. All right, it's snare drum time. This is what we're working with, okay? Not the most impressive snare drum sound. So what we're going to do before we even process this snare directly, we're going to get a sample involved. Heck, let's get 2 samples involved. Here's the deal. Here's the rub. Here's the skinny. Even with programmed drums, sometimes you need to blend some snares together. So what we have up here, again, is the snare from Get Good Drums Modern Massive. It's the COB snare. Nothing going on. Just little puffs of air. The reason I used the COB snare is because of how it sounds in the overheads and the rooms, okay? So listen to this. It's got a nice splashy reverb to it. And that's really the main role that that snare is doing in our drum mix. But to get the snare sound, what I actually used for the snare sound, now I can actually delete these extra plugins off the end because it's just trigger. And here I have a file that I found on the internet back in 2010, simply called ParamoreSnare.wave. I don't think it's legal that I have this. I don't think it's legal that I'm sharing it. So don't tell anybody, okay? This is our secret. I have a file called Paramore Snare. I don't know where I got it. I don't know where it comes from originally, but it sounds like this. Now that's a fat, gushy snare. That's a sick snare drum sound. That's a big, ringy, but not Saint Anger ringy, resonant masterpiece of a snare drum, okay? So I got those running through trigger. Every time the snare drum gets hit, that goes off. Bada boom, bada bing. I wanted to process it further because I'm a maniac. Because if we listen to it in context with the instruments and everything, it's still just kind of smacking. It's not this larger than life, crazy, EDM tinged monster snare, which is what we want. We want that big, mushy, gushy, smacky, every adjective at the same time snare drum sound to get that Bring Me the Horizon vibe. So let's move to a different part of the song. I'm sick of listening to the intro. Let's go over to the verse because it's just a bunch of snare drums going pa, 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 pa. Perfect. So what did I do to the Paramore snare to make it sound so big? Because without any processing, it was like this. With some of the processing, it sounds like this. Much more round and full and all the things that big is adjacent to on the adjective circle of fifths. So first order of business. It's got some weird, I don't know if you can hear it, okay? I can hear it, and I can also see it on this little graph. This little Look at this. What is that? Gross, and that too, on the tail off. This gross ringing between 15K and 18K, way up there. If you're above 30, odds are slim you can hear those frequencies, but I somehow I can still hear them, and they irritate the piss out of me. So I took Soothe. I said, Soothe, can you deal with this? And Soothe said, okay. And so now it's just pinching on to the crazy high end. Also some of the high mids, because there's just a lot happening with the snare drum. I wanted it fuller and thumpier, and it was very smacky out the gate. So we got rid of some of the high mids dynamically with Soothe, and then we got rid of a lot of the high highs because they were disgusting also with Soothe. That's what this notch is here. I don't know if I've ever explained this to you, and if you're not familiar with Soothe, this can kind of look like magic. So I'm going to take a minute and explain this one to you. This white line here is an EQ that you are setting to the detection circuit of Soothe. So you're telling Soothe, listen here, quite literally. Listen to these frequencies and extra target them in the case of things that are above the dark blue, light blue divide. So this red dot up here is me telling super focus up here. Listen to that, and anytime it speaks up, you boop it on the nose with a rolled up newspaper and say bad dog. So that's what this one is. And then this curve sloping down is I'm setting a high pass on Soothe, saying ignore everything below like 2K. Don't even front, dog. And so when you look at the dips in the dark blue area, it's not like doing anything below around 2K. If I move this, now we're seeing some motion in the lower mids. So yeah, that's Soothe. It's a dynamic EQ that targets frequencies to be removed based on the input parameters that you recommend. So like sharpness and selectivity are what they sound like. You can turn sharpness down. You've got a more broad reduction. You turn it up, you've got sharper reduction. Selectivity, if you turn it down, it's not being selective. It's indiscriminately slamming down frequencies. Turn it up, it's more likely gonna target the trouble spots for you. So yeah, that's Soothe, and you should be 6.9, young man. Mind your manners. So that was step 1 of processing the Paramore snare. Step 2, Brit N on the virtual channel ccslate.com, just to give it the same flavor as the kick. I just throw this on everything. It doesn't like do a lot. It's like a little pinch of salt that I enjoy. After that, I boosted the fuck out of the low end. We're talking 8.44 decibels at 80 hertz, just right up there. This is actually turned off, so I'm gonna get rid of it because it's turned off. But that's really what I've done here. And then I've also turned on the drive and turned the line up about 12 decibels. What that does is it drives it. It's a saturation circuit. So you're taming off the tops of the peak, not quite clipping. It's more saturating, more like Saturn than Event Horizon, but you're just shaving off the tippy tips of the transients and rounding out the sound. So this is before and after this low boost drive circuit. Before, it's literally howling. Do you hear that? It goes from ba, 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 ba to boo, 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 boo. Like it's really, really giving her. Disgusting. Over the top, dare I say. I'm into it. It's a little messy. Let's put it in context. Okay, without that, so we've added the roundness and the full body. However, it's a little uncontrolled. And Bring Me the Horizon's sound is very controlled. And nothing says control like taking a compressor like an 1176 and saying, hey, no you don't, and just woo! Reshaping the whole dynamic spectrum of the sound. So you're getting that smack, you're getting that whap, you're getting that swoop. And so that's from having the slow attack setting. I mean, it's a pretty fast compressor, but as slow as it goes, because if I turn the attack all the way up, where's the impact? It's just whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. But if we turn it back down, yeah. It's got that bite, it's got that bark. We've got the fastest release setting, so transient happens, right? Compressor dips down, immediately compressor goes back up. So you're getting the impact of the transient, a moment of reprieve, and then wham, the sustain of the snare hitting you for like just a quick 1-2, so fast you hear it as one bigger sound. It's fucking awesome. I love compressors. I cannot gloat about the existence of compressors in our universe enough. If we ever discover multiverse travel and we find a universe that's ours minus compressors, I'm gonna laugh in their face every waking second of my day, because compressors are so cool, and I'm stoked that we get to play with them. Let's listen to what this compressor does when the snare drum starts like really going. So this is the next kind of 2 bars without the compressor. So you notice on that fill, it's just kind of like wah, pa, 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 and it like, I don't know, it sounded a little robo and a little sterile and a little whatever. Let's put the compressor on it though. So with that slow attack, fast release combo, the compressor is kind of like pumping and driving, like having a tug of war against those 8th notes or 16th notes. Fast snare hits. I don't know, it just adds this really aggressive character and keeps things in line in a way that makes me really stoked and really excited and really happy. So that's with, again, all buttons in mode. I was not being tame here. All buttons in is a setting on 1176 style compressors. So right now here you've got the ratio. You got 4, 8, 12, and 20. It compresses more as you go up. The all setting is like a little hack that you can do with 1176s, where on certain models, if you jam all 4 buttons in just right, it engages all 4 circuits at the same time, and it sounds fucking ridiculous. So this is that in software form, and we have done it. So just to make sure that nothing's getting a little too hairy, a little too dicey, we're doing a lot of compression to the transient of the snare drum. We're gonna clip it just to make sure we don't have any overs, we don't have any wayward spikes, we don't have any unwanted guests at the dinner table that is our feast of duality. So let's look at what Event Horizon is doing to this sample track. It's shaving off quite a lot. It's peaking around minus 4.5 decibels. I have the threshold set to -9. So it's taking, there's a 4.5 decibel difference there. Just shaving them off, saying, hey, no. As if the brutal, unforgiving compressor wasn't enough. We've followed it up with a clipper just to really drive the point home. Daddy's home, and he's saying you're allowed to be this loud. You can have the apparent volume louder than that, but I'm gonna clip you off at 9. So yeah, that's what I did. And then to aid in the goal of having a round snare, I've actually gone and cut some highs, a relatively wide 2 decibel cut, 2 octave wide bandwidth, 5.5 kilohertz. You can actually see on the little graph of the EQ, there's a bit of that hump up there. And so I'm just counteracting that a bit and more evenly distributing the frequencies of the snare drum, because the top end of this particular snare sample is like basically just white noise. So white noise is even across the entire frequency spectrum. So that's what I worked to do with that EQ move, was just, it had a little hump around 5.5 hertz. So I said, no, you don't. And I smoothed it out. So it's just a blast of literal like static coming off this. Let's listen to it soloed. It's static with a low-end thump attached. It's beautiful. It's actually beautiful. And I didn't stop there. I wasn't done. Seldom am I done so soon. What I proceeded to do, and I'm going to engage automation here. This blue line is the mix knob of a compressor that is in this chain. Boom, baby. So what have I done? Well, not a lot. I boosted some 7.2 kilohertz on the Neve EQ that's in Slate's virtual mix rack. This particular frequency with a 1 to 3 decibel boost, I don't know what it is, but I love the way it sounds on snare drums. I absolutely love the way that it sounds on snare drums. So let's mute this Architect snare. We'll get into that. We will get into that. But let's listen to what this boost does. Let's kill the compressor and the clipper. We'll just listen to the EQ, okay? Without. With. Just that right amount of bite on the top end that really lets the snare cut through the mix. I'll let it play through and I'll just turn off and on and off and on. It just sounds a little more modern, a little more focused, and a little more bright, obviously, because I turned up the bright frequency. But yeah, so that was the EQ move. And then this is the pièce de résistance of what I did with this mix, okay? Throughout the song, I am driving this compressor, which when it's fully engaged, listen to this. It is pinching down and squashing the tits off of this snare drum. Every single hit got smaller, yet somehow spread out. It's like you're spreading peanut butter. It's like spreading peanut butter on a snare drum, and also the snare drum is the peanut butter. And then Leonardo DiCaprio shows up and he says, "This isn't even the real dream." And you go a layer deeper. That's what this compressor is to me. Now, when the song is big and open, I back off the mix knob of the compressor with the automation. So in the intro, it's coming at 35%. Because it's this big, epic, we want that sustain there. We want the biggest snare drum sound we can get. When things get a little more tight and intimate, such as the verse, we bring the snare down and sort of mush it out a bit so that it's not overpowering the sparse arrangement. And then in this little gap here, so those particular two snare drums are kind of the punctuation of that line. So we've got it compressed. Those two snare drums, I have the compressor turned off, and then it kicks right back in as things continue. And so basically, anytime there's a big drum fill, I didn't want the snare to overpower the arrangement, so I would have the compressor ride up and back off. And then there's another fill coming, so Just like that, easy peasy. It's a really cool way to keep the energy alive in a mix, is just automate the compression in and out, which is extra easy if you've got the Slate Virtual Mix Rack. Most of the plugins in here have a mix knob so that you can decide how much of it you want in the sound at any given time, just by, moving an automation lane around. And after that, just to be super sure that I wasn't breaking any Geneva conventions, I added Event Horizon just to shave off the peaks and make sure the snare never goes above -6 decibels. And it absolutely doesn't, but we just want to make sure. We want to be safe. Now, there are 2 snare samples happening here, and I wish I could show you the exact settings in the Architect's One Kit Wonder, also by Get Good Drums, that I used for this sort of kick and snare combo, but it crashes my computer and it corrupts the sessions, and it's a terrible, terrible, terrible design. I don't know why it does it. It happens quite consistently. Anytime I use this plugin, I have to open it, set the settings, bounce it out. I have to have the drums finished, bounce out the sounds I want, and then close it before it can crash my computer. And I'm not going to risk that in the middle of like a 4-hour filming session. So we're just dealing with a stereo sample here. But the nice thing about One Kit Wonder is there's not a lot of mix settings. So if you listen here, it's really just the dry snare sound and the dry kick sound. Now let's go in and look at what I've done to it. It has some sort of resonance around 270 hertz. I've carved that out. It's also got like a lot of high-end presence that I wasn't super stoked on. I just wanted the thump out of the snare. So if we listen to just the EQ move that I've done here, we've got this little intro segment, and then EQing out the frequencies I'm not huge on. And then I'm compressing it to give it a little bit more aggression. You'll notice it's only reacting when the snare's getting hit, and I've got the snare quite a bit louder than the kick. I didn't want a lot of the Architect's kick. I just kind of liked the attack of it. I didn't need it loud enough that the body was getting through. And then I wanted to compress the snare to sort of match the aggression that was found in the Paramore snare. I mean, so that's what I did without the compression, with the compression. Just brings the snare a little more life. And then typical Todd move, we're just clipping it quite a lot. It's actually peaking. The Architect's snare in its little vacuum is going above 0 decibels. And I'm shaving off down 6. I'm not turning it down 6 decibels. I am hard clipping it so that anything above that -6 is literally distorting into oblivion and stops existing. I think it sounds pretty cool. It's just like a little blast of noise, which again is kind of what I was looking for in the Paramore sample. This was just a way for me to fine tune it that much further. And I got a little silly. Okay, so Brit N setting on the virtual channel strip thing, adding 4.20 decibels at 80 hertz, and then driving it all the way up with the Neve. And then again, this custom series EQ is doing nothing, so I'm just going to delete it. And that's what this move sounds like without it. With it. Adding that body there. Remember earlier in the Paramore snare when I was like, oh, it's just a smack, and then now it's howling. Oh, oh, oh. So same deal here. Just a smack, howling. Ooh, ooh. That's more of like a gorilla noise. Yeah, it's okay. So Paramore snare is our howl. Architect snare is our grunt, I guess is how I would phrase that one. And then I'm compressing it again because I'm a disgusting creature. You'll notice this time, the kick's getting involved. And this time, the compression is hitting it so hard that the entire character of the kick drum is actually changing. So here's the kick drum by itself. Full, thuddy, bassy. I've compressed it so hard it's just fucking, like, it's a mid-range knock. All that from compression. That's not an EQ move. That is compression. So I really like that. It's gross and aggressive and unnecessary. And I feel like we had enough of it. Like, if we listen without the Architect sample, it's big and open and mean, but it's also like a little too nice. So with that compressed move, it just got mean. You know what I'm saying? It's pretty sweet. So I've added another clipper because it wasn't distorted and mean and gross enough for me. This one's a safety clip. We're peaking at 8.6. We set the clipper at 9 just to make sure we had no overs. And then there wasn't enough of a ooh to the sound. So I just boosted a butt ton. I boosted 6 decibels at basically where an A sharp is, because this song is an A sharp minor. So it's just a gross low knock and a good amount of body. And then I had a little bit of self-restraint. So I turned it down 15 decibels. So now the snare sample mix sounds like this. This is without the processing on the samples. And then with the processing on the samples. Just big, open, tight, mean, all the adjectives. That's what we're going for. We want a snare that is everything all at once. Now that we've got the sample dialed, let's go in and look at the actual snare track processing. I suppose that's the next move. Goodness gracious. Now that we've got our snare drum samples, which granted are the bulk of the sound in this particular track, now that we've got those sorted, let's look at the actual close snare mics. Now, you might be thinking that the snare samples are doing all the heavy lifting of this mix, but if we turn down our snare track and it's just the samples and the rooms and the overheads and we don't have the close mics involved, we have a big blast of air, but we don't have any immediate impact. And so the immediate impact is going to come from our snare close mic. Now, here is our raw snare sound. Now, when I say raw, keep in mind, okay, this is important, I did some pre-mixing over here. I've got the turbo turned all the way up. So we've got this snare sounding as good as Modern and Massive dictated it could sound within the parameters of the in-the-box mixing available within the plugin. It's not good enough for me. We're gonna go even further beyond. So first order of business. Oh shit, wait, I lost it. Let's listen to this raw snare. There's a frequency there. There's a couple frequencies there. I'm not in love with them. Let's listen to it again. Boo, ba, boo, 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 boo. It's somewhere up there. So I went through and I targeted the 2 recurring frequencies that made gross sounds in this snare drum. This particular hit had it pretty bad. So let's just loop it. Magic! So the treble frequencies were happening at 280 and 400 hertz. And you can even see them. If I get rid of these 2 notches and let the EQ run, you can see these 2 little humps. You've got your fundamental down around 200, and then these 2 resonances happening above that. So I just killed them. I didn't like kill them dead, but I turned them down 6 decibels with pretty tight bands. That was that. That's first order business. Basically, anytime I'm working with a snare drum, especially like a raw snare drum, which I know this is like a processed VST kit, but like it's still got things about it that are reminiscent of any raw snare drum I've encountered in my like recording real drums producer life. Same shit. It had some frequencies that had to go, and that is priority numero uno. I'm gonna sit back. I've been sitting very forward this whole time. I've been talking for an hour now. Next order of business is soothe. Typical Todd settings, 6.9 sharpness selectivity, depth at 3. This is just in the default mode. And what it's doing to the snare, getting rid of a lot of the harshness in the high end. Rounding out the sound. Again, Bring Me the Horizon, very thuddy snare sound. Trying to get rid of all the high-end peaks. Not trying to get rid of all the high-end frequencies, just the peaks, so that the snare can be big and explosive sounding. After that, we've got ourselves some compression. Now let's move over to a busier section. So here is the midsection of the verse. Snare soloed, no compression yet. And then we compress it. This time, a little bit of restraint, 4:1 ratio. Slowest attack available on the 1176, fastest release, so the transient's coming through, and then you're getting hit with that sustain right after, a good old 1-2 punch. It's like a blast of air. In context so far, all we've done is EQ, soothe, compress. That's raw. So same deal as we were doing with the kick track. We're reining it in and tightening it while trying to emphasize the attack of the drum. There's a whole lot of body and like forward presence on this raw track. The EQ getting rid of the uglier frequencies, soothe kind of smoothing things out, and the compression reining it in while emphasizing the transients. Particularly on that snare roll, it's a lot meaner without having to be messier. So I'm pretty stoked on how that was all turning out. And I followed that up with another instance of FabFilter Saturn 2 warm tape setting. I think that's the default one it opens with. I don't like messing a lot in like the inner workings of a lot of these plugins. Like if you open it up, you've got like 4 different tubes, 4 different tapes. Jesus, is that 9 different amps? 3 different kinds of saturation, 3 different transformers, 5 different effects. And then you've got like mix, feedback, frequency, dynamics, tone shaping. Like, oh, stop it. Linear phase, not linear phase, multi-bands. I know I multi-banded on the kick, but with the snare, I don't know, man. Just shut up. Stop throwing things at me. We're going to go with just warm tape because it's what happened when I opened the plugin. We're going to go up a little less than halfway. That's it. I'm not going to fight with you. I just want to hear what it does. So what I do is I open this thing up. I start on 0. I listen to what it does on full. And then I unsolo it. I do the same thing. I make a decision while I'm scrolling through that drive knob or mix knob or whatever plugin I'm doing, whatever parameter it is that I'm adjusting, and I make just a binary mix decision. Most of my mix decisions, most of them, are binary. Do I like this? Yes or no. If no, I try something else. And again, yes or no. In this case, I do like it. But turning it all the way up was obviously a little bit too much. So I had it down at like 35.5%. And I found that that was the sweet spot for me on this snare track. Let's go back to the beginning of the song so you can hear sort of the static of the saturation off those like first 2 snare hits. And then with the saturation. It just adds a bit of like off the back end of the snare that I'm super into. So I ran with it. Mix knob, 100%. Drive knob, 35%. Warm tape, saturation. Sounds pretty cool. Maybe it needs to be taught a lesson though. So a lesson I taught it indeed. I'm going to turn a couple of these off. We're going to go a step at a time here. Step one, as always, Brit N VCC channel. The slate thing adds a little bit of a low end hump. I like it. Let's do a before and after of it. See if you can even hear a difference. Maybe it's all in my head. Who knows? Before. After. Could be all in my head. Anyway, I run it on every channel, so I figure let's keep it consistent. And then I'm shaving off the super highs, so 16K rolled off. I took the low end knob on the Custom Series EQ and I said, and I turned it all the way up, which gave us this. So before that move, after that move, big, explosive, thuddy. I'm not done yet. I boosted 1.5 decibels at that magic frequency, that 7.2 kilohertz that I like on the Neve EQ. That's not enough. I boosted another 10 decibels at 80 hertz. That's a low shelf boost. So that's 20 decibels of low end off these EQs on this one channel strip alone. And drove it 12 decibels. I didn't turn it up. That's what this drive setting does. It keeps the volume consistent while letting you drive into a saturation circuit. I drove it 12 decibels just to shave off the crispness of the attack and let the body sing through. So before and after those moves, it's really cool. It's doing a lot. I'm having a good time with it. Snare drum EQing. Let's roll with it. That wasn't enough. That was big and explosive and mean and ugly due to the 20 decibels of low end I added. However, why would I show moderation now? I used Monster, the Monster, Extreme Dynamic Processor. What this plugin was like Slate Digital's answer to the all buttons in mode that's found up here in the CLA 76 or any 1176 compressor. It just added more features. You've got a punch knob that like slows the attack time down to let more of the transient through. And then you've got a high frequency detection that's sort of like a sidechain EQ'd circuit thing for the detection of this compressor. And what that means, if you're not familiar with a sidechain EQ on a compressor, is I'm telling the detection circuit of the compressor, can you behave as if the high frequencies were turned up 12 decibels, please and thank you? So it's going to overreact to high frequencies, such as the attack of a snare drum. So it's just making it behave even more aggressive than it needs to. And that's why they call it the Monster. So before and after the Monster, it's just like, it's so compressed, it doesn't even sound good anymore. But in the context of the mix, I think it's pretty neat. So here's the intro without the Monster on the direct snare mic. It's like a little too open and like real drums sounding. So when we fuck it up, it's like approaching just straight up sounding like a gunshot at this point, which I think is pretty neat. And then after that, I ran the clipper on it. So it's coming in -3 decibels. I'm shaving 3 decibels off the peaks with a clipper. And I mean, that's the snare chain. Let's look at toms and overheads, I suppose. All right, really quick before we get into the toms and cymbals and overheads and all that fun stuff, there's a snare reverb I neglected to mention. So let's listen to that. Here it is by itself. It's just big and greasy and mean. So what it is on the back end is it's each snare individually. So we've got the snare close mic, the Paramore snare, and the Architect snare, each running into this reverb simultaneously. I'm running Super Plate by Sound Toys, which is it's a plate reverb. I don't use a lot of reverbs. This one has a nice, easy interface, and it sounds good. So I'm running it on the AudioCon setting. Now, as I click around, you'll notice that each of those 5 modes sounds drastically different from the previous. So I just kind of went through until I found the one that was least offensive to my ears within the context of this snare drum. I've got it ringing out for about 2 seconds. I just discovered that there's a tweak setting. So we're just going to close that because I have no idea what it is. I literally learned that right now. But I was running the low pass and high pass filters. I guess we can open it up so we can take a look at it. I'm running this at around, it looks to be about 7K. It starts sloping off the top end, and around 300 hertz, it starts sloping off the low end. So it's a very upper mid focused reverb, very splashy, which is how I was describing the way that the snare drum sounds in the rooms and the overheads of the Get Good Drums tracks, which we will get to later on. And so this is what I was looking at and what I was working with when I set this mix. I put on the AudioCon setting, about 2 seconds of a tail, 36 millisecond pre-delay. Now what a pre-delay is, all it is, as far as I'm aware, is the sound happens, pre-delay, time passes, reverb happens. The longer that you have your pre-delay set, the closer to you the source material will sound. So from 0 to 10 millisecond pre-delay, you're listening to something that's far away. The reverb and the sound off the source are hitting you at the same time because they're far away. The closer the source is to you, the sooner you're going to hear the source sound, which is the snare close mics in this case, relative to the reverb then bouncing off the walls and bouncing back to you. So 36 millisecond pre-delay to me is similar to like both you and the drums are like a third of the room away from each other in a big open studio. There's space between you, but you're still probably closer to it than a lot of the walls. That's kind of the sweet spot for me. 20 to 40 millisecond pre-delay is where I like my snare drums to happen. Now, if we turn the mix knob down and I'll turn the pre-delay up, I'll show you what that's like. So let's crank this. So you're hearing the snare, and then the reverb smacking off the walls of this imaginary room we're in. And then as I drag this down, you'll notice it sounds more cohesive and like the reverb is part of the sound of, the source sound as well. So the close snare and the reverb sound are hitting us at relatively the same time. If we down it to 0, the reverb and the snare are one and the same. Just a little bit of separation adds just a taste of that slap for me that makes it sound like I'm in a room with a drummer, and the sound is happening from the snare and the walls separately like in real life. It just sounds more realistic. I hope that made an ounce of sense to you. I keep the wet all the way up because we already have the dry source sound coming off of the close mic channels. This way, this is just a reverb track. I turn the modulation up halfway. I do that on every single reverb plugin because I know what it does. It's like pitch and timing variation similar to a chorus pedal. I'm indiscriminate with it. If it has a modulation knob, I'm turning it up to noon and I'm forgetting about it. And then I trim the input down 7 decibels just to sort of have the reverb not take over the drums. So this is without the reverb, with the reverb. Just that little bit of spice when the snare's by itself sounds pretty huge. I like it. And then I follow the reverb up with soothe, just getting rid of any high-end spikes that might get in the way of our ears' enjoyment. Because if I get rid of soothe, there's just like a mess happening in the high end. It sounds like plates crashing in the distance, which makes sense. It's a plate reverb, but I try to keep the sound more focused on the body of the snare through this whole mix, and so this was just another instance of me continuing that trend, soothing out the upper mids with soothe. Moving on! Toms. Here's what we've got. We've gated the toms. Now, I know. Why do I have 3 toms being hit? Drummers only have 2 arms. 'Cause it sounds cool is why. It's just a nice big, you know. It's a big epic intro. I just wanted it larger than life. As we go in later in the song, I don't do the 3 toms at the same time thing as much. I use them more naturally through fills, but that first tom hit I thought was pretty important. So I have 3 happening at once. Now, the first thing I'm noticing is the toms are like too big and round and muddy sounding. They're fine, but I don't want fine. I want to sound kind of sick. So I did a lot of stuff to it to make it sound kind of sick. Now, I consider this whole strip to be sort of one effect. So I'm going to glaze over a little bit of it. I'll really focus on this transient designer here and its relationship to the compressor. So Brit N, because it's what I do, I took the highest band and the lowest band of this API EQ, and I just turned them down a little bit to get rid of the subs and the super high end, because I wanted it kind of like upper mid focused. I also scooped a little bit out at 600 hertz. I will show you this move before and after on these toms here. That's with it. So it's not doing a lot, but it's just sort of like softening the toms a little bit. And then in the vein of softening the toms, I used the drive setting only, of the Slate FGN just to soften the transients with the saturator on there. You can hear it more on the floor tom than you do on the rack tom. Just took some of that click off the high end. And then things got a little out of hand. I went to the transient shaper. I turned the transients up 5 and the sustain up 1 and a bit. That sounds like this. Let's turn it off. Thum thum, thum thum. Turn it on. There's just like tight. It's not like a clicky attack, but the attack is super focused because I turned the transient up. And then by turning the sustain up as well, but by a smaller amount, we're kind of doing a similar thing to what we were doing with the snare drum and the kick drum with the 1176s, but this is more like slower acting and, in my opinion, tailored to how toms sound. So I thought that sounded pretty cool. If we go back into the full mix, they sound great. So I think those toms sound awesome, but I feel like they didn't have enough like bite and attack and angst. So I compressed them with the FG2A, which is like a slower compressor, much slower than the 1176. Because toms are more focused in like the mids and lows, whereas a kick drum even, it has that low end thump, but it's also got the snappy attack. And the snare drum has a lot of high end in the transient. You want this like really aggressive, fast compression on a kick and a snare, or at least I do. On toms, I like things a little slower. I find it brings out the toms version of the aggression, with the slower compressor. So I used the 2A. It's compressing really hard. 5 to 10 decibels when it hits. That needle, on that last fill, that needle was almost down all the way. And so to me, that sounds cool and aggressive and awesome, but like too clean, too clicky again. We've kind of found ourselves in a better sounding version of where we were earlier. Now, I do not like to look back and make changes. I like to press forward, and with each solution, maybe I create another problem or two. That's okay. Fixing my problems as I make them arise through my other hackneyed solutions. In this instance, we're going to start by targeting the perceived clickiness that has made itself known just by running Soothe. Look at how much it's just ducking down of the high end. This is without it. Very clicky, very bright. A lot more focused mid-centric attack. It's cutting like 12 decibels in the peaks of the high end. It's not the same as taking a high end shelf and dipping down all the highs, because there is still high end there. It's just taking the peaks of the high end and massaging them down into the sound. So I think that sounds pretty dope. Also a little too clean though. I feel like we added some aggression with the compression. That rhymed, but it was a little too clean. So then I took saturation knob. I put it on the keep low setting. I did not want the low end of the toms to go from boom to boom. What I did want was just a little bit of dirt and grit on the top end. So soft tube saturation knob with the keep low setting keeps the low end intact and saturates your mids and highs. So if we solo it before, very clean. There's a little bit of airy grit now, especially coming off that floor tom, where instead of ba-doo, it's ba-doo, just a little bit of something. I don't know, it really does it for me. If we crank saturation knob up all the way, like if we crank the knob up just a little more, you hear how it's like wubbing out? But there's a sweet spot there where you can really hear what it's doing. Without it, it's just adding this gnarly character that I'm super into. So I'm just gonna undo back all the way here to those original settings. I wanted a subtle saturation. So before I had it turned up to around here. It's a little much. It's a little much. So I brought it back down to 9 o'clock. That's the right amount of dirt to me. Now, as I've mentioned in previous videos, soft tube saturation knob does not have a volume knob. As you turn up the saturator, it also turns up your source sound, which is a huge bummer. So what I did was I turned the gain of this EQ down 7.5 decibels to sort of offset the volume boost of saturation knob. I also cleaned up the low end a lot. I did a low shelf cut, 4 decibels at 100 hertz, and a 6 decibel mid cut at 360. So let's check those two changes out at the same time on these tom hits. So this is before saturation and EQ, and then with the saturation and EQ. It's like you can hear the attack of the tom now, and the body is there because we saturated sort of everything but the lows. So the lows are intact, turned down a little. So they're clean and present, while the top end is saturated and aggressive. We've got another fill coming up here where we'll really hear these changes shine. If we turn off all these effects, it's like a little too clean and wubby. But if we put these effects back on, it's just tighter and cleaner. Similar treatment to what we did with the kick earlier. We were just trying to rein in the low end and saturate the highs. And then I put a clipper on it because it's what I do. Nothing too crazy, nothing to write home about. But yeah, that's what I did to the toms. And then the overheads and cymbals, I kind of grouped them together. I'm not processing these tracks individually. I'm letting them all run in together. So we've got our small diaphragm overheads. Very cymbal focused. And then we've got our large diaphragm overheads. Very tom focused. We've got our ride cymbal, which I exclusively crash. I love crashing on a ride. And then we got our hi-hats. All that bust in together. First, we're hitting it with Soothe. I just used the cymbal smooth preset. I didn't think too much about it. I just cracked Soothe open. I was like, hey, there's some brittleness going on in these cymbals. Let's see what Soothe has that remedies it. The hi-hats are kind of forward and harsh. Now they're not so much. So that was easy. From there, I drove the crap out of it with the Slate FGN. As I've been doing kind of this whole time, I really wanted this like saturated, multi-layered, like not like a distortion on the drums, but just a general vibe of saturation across the whole thing. So each track more or less ended up with this drive setting on it. And then I put the overheads smooth preset. Again, I don't like thinking too much when I'm mixing. So especially cymbals, there's so much going on in terms of frequency content. I've got Soothe there to get rid of the ugly, disgusting, spiky frequencies for me. And then I've got this overhead smooth preset that smooths out the overheads. So it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. The saturation on the FGN smooths out the overall signal, and then the overhead smooth compression setting just smooths out the dynamics of it all. So here are the overheads without this. With. Without. It's not doing a lot. It's really not doing a lot. We're just making sure things are nice and tight. Didn't have to do any EQing. Don't really care to. Overheads are kind of like an image of the kit. I don't like messing with that too much. And then we've got our rooms. Again, these are not individually treated. I treat them as one big thing. So we've got our mono room sound. A lot of kick and a lot of cymbals in that one. We've got our close room. It's more snare. A lot of kick attack in this one too. And then our room far. Lots of cymbals. Lots of snare. Not a lot of kick. Bust all together, we have this overall room sound. Which all summed together sounds like you're in a room with someone playing drums. It's a pretty cool blend, and I like having the three different mics, because then you can fine tune, like, I like the way the kick sounds in the room far or in the room close, and I like the way the toms sound in the room mono, and I like the snare in the room far. And you can just create the blend of sounds that you want. That's something you can't do with real drums that you can do with these three knobs at the end of every Modern and Massive page. You know, you can set the room mono, room close, room far settings to your own tastes on a per kit element basis. It's pretty gnarly. I like it a lot. Now, how do I treat the rooms? I suppose that's the important part here. Very similar to how I treat the overheads, because I consider overheads kind of like an image of the kit in like a micro sense, and then the room mics are the macro of that. We're further away, we're larger than life, it's big, open, and spacious. Overheads, to me, are just tighter sounding room mics. So we're gonna do a lot of the same stuff. We're gonna hit it with Soothe on the cymbal smooth setting. Without. With. It's very, very subtle, but to me it's important in making sure we don't have an abundance of upper mid frequencies clouding things up, because that's where the guitar is gonna live, that's where the vocal's gonna live. I don't want the cymbals really getting in the way of that. So that preset on Soothe does a good job of just autopiloting it for me. Now, we've got the Brit N setting on the VCC channel. Same old, nothing crazy. I'm getting rid of 3 decibels at 2 kilohertz on this room track. Now, there's a lot of cymbal and a lot of snare in our room. My vocal lives primarily at this frequency. So all I was doing was preemptively saying, hey, look, I know my voice, I know where my peaks tend to sit. I'm gonna remove this frequency from the room tracks now, so it's not a problem down the line. I've then also gone ahead and cut below 100 hertz and above 16K, because those are your sub and super bright frequencies, which you're more likely to hear when you're close to a source, and I wanted the rooms to sound further away. And that's an easy way to do that, is just get rid of the lows and the highs, and now the sound is just magically a little more in the background. I followed that up by driving the crap out of it again with the FGN. No EQ happening on the EQ portion of this plugin, just the drive cranked all the way for some saturation and flavor. And then I've got a distressor, the FG Stress here. It's on the drum room big setting. And it's just cruising at a consistent 5 to 12 decibels of gain reduction if we crank the mix knob. It's big and squashed and mean. It's a little too much though. So I have the mix down around 30%. So if we listen before and after all of those settings, here's the room mic in the verse. Raw, open drum room. It sounds further away, and it's more focused in the low mids. And those are all the individual components of the drum kit. So next, I'm gonna show you my drum folder processing, as well as my individual dedicated drum bus compressor. All right, drum bus processing. I've got a few layers of it happening here. So we've got the Get Good Drums processing, which was all the individual components from GGD, you know, our kick, our snare, our toms, all that stuff. We've got our samples all in a folder. We've got our verb. Those are all going into a folder that I've called Drum Kit. Now, Drum Kit, very subtle moves here, very subtle moves. I've shaved off the super high end because, you know, pre-recorded VST drums can sound a little brittle. So I just automatically, without thinking, these are settings I do every single time. I shave off the high end, 20 kilohertz, low pass. And then in the Infinity EQ, I use the mid-side settings. I cut around 110 hertz, just a few decibels around the mids, just gone. And then I boost like a high shelf above about 10K on the sides. So we're getting rid of some of the mud in the snare and the kick with this yellow one, this mid cut. And then we're adding some brilliance specifically to the cymbals with this side boost in the highs. And then in both channels, so this is just normal EQ, not mid-side, I cut a little bit, a little bit, a little bit, a tiny amount at 500 hertz and a tiny amount at 2K. So this is just like where the mud of the drums lives. So I cut that. This is where my vocal and guitar are going to be spending a lot of energy, is around 2K. So I just cut a little bit. So this is before and after those cuts. Hear how much snappier it got? They were very subtle moves, but I feel like they did a lot to open up the sound. And then things get a little hairy. Things get a little dicey. Things get a little insane. So we've got another instance of me running 7 plugins in a row, and most of them are saturators and compressors. But we've got another instance of the VCC channel, Brit N, driving it a little, 6 decibel into the drive setting. All we're doing with this FGN, we're not using the drive for once. We're actually boosting around 1K, 0.69 decibels, just to give the snare a little bit more forward-facing presence. And then the FG Stress has a setting called Drum Bus Parallel. I just ran it. Didn't think about it. Just like, yeah, I want to compress the drum bus. So I did that. And then I used Revival, which is like a harmonics exciter, I believe. Added a little bit of thickness and a little bit of shimmer. So before that, that really livened things up and made it sound tight and modern and huge. Now, while I'm mixing, I already have these all turned on. I just want to make sure that's perfectly clear. Everything that we had heard leading up to now, we had these engaged, and the reason for that was because that's how I mix. I leave these on, I forget about them, and then I mix kind of into this chain. So the purpose of me showing you this now is just to show you what that chain is that I mix into. So after all that, I run the clipper, and it's just catching the occasional peak. You know, we're peaking maybe around, you know, -2.5, -2.3 decibels. I'm running the clipper at 3, just very subtle, if any, clipping going on. And then to give it just like a little bit of vibe, I throw on virtual tape machines, which gives us this sound. Very low end focused, forward, smooths out the high end a little bit. There is a little bit of a volume boost with tape machines. Usually I turn the output down about a decibel and a half to make it even. But at this stage, I've got it kind of made up for through the other moves in the chain, which is actually taken care of on the exact next part of my typical drum chain. Now, these are things, again, I do want to say, I have these on every mix before I even start mixing. I just plop it on, that's the Todd sound, and we're starting with that. And then I tailor it from there with those individual mic settings. So this one, we're cutting 2 decibels around 200 hertz, cutting 3 decibels at around 500 hertz, and doing a high shelf boost around 14K to give us some of that shimmer. And then we're turning everything down a decibel with the gain here to offset the boost we got on the tape machine. So without this EQ setting, and with it, that's the sauce. Muddy, knocky drums. Fantastico. So this chain that I'm running allows me to basically make a bunch of ignorant decisions on the back end and worry about what sounds cool and fun and exciting, because I've already taken care of sort of the tidying with my bus chain. I also run Decapitator in the mix as well. Let's solo the drums. And I'll show you what this is doing. So without Decapitator, it's just an aggression knob. Off, fully on. So I leave that just shy of halfway up. And then I've been running this Smart EQ setting for quite some time. So what Smart EQ is it's a plugin that you tell it with this menu up here, like, hey, you're running across the drum bus. This is drums. It's also got different settings for specific parts of the kit. Like you could run it on kick. You could run it on snare, piano, electric guitar, cello, bass, acoustic guitar, vocal high, vocal low, universal, speech high, speech low, speech universal, like all sorts of stuff. Synth is in there. So this was like a year and a half ago. I ran it across a drum bus, and whatever this curve is, I love it. I love it. So what you do is you tell it what you're doing, you hit this little green record button and you hit play, and it listens to your drums or kick or vocal or whatever you tell it. And it then applies this like predetermined EQ curve across your track. So I ran this a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago once, and I said, hey, I like that. I copy and paste the same setting. It's from my Anthem Part 2 mix. I copy this smart EQ setting from that every single time. Wide band across the whole spectrum, because you can choose kind of your highs and lows. Like you can tell it to ignore certain frequency ranges and stuff like that. I just kind of leave it up. I run it at 69 strength because it's a funny number, and tends to put this boost in around 150 hertz. And the last EQ move I did, I was kind of cutting in that range. So I didn't want it, you know, it's shaping the lows down. I didn't want it then boosting in that area. So, you know, if I turn it off, you've got this big hump there. So I didn't like that. So I add my own little cut, and I just smooth out this so it's at least flat and not boosting. But that's it. That's really all I do. I just copy and paste the same setting over and over again, which cuts a little bit of the lows, cuts a little bit of these low mids, does some weird wiggly chicanery through the mids, and then boosts some highs. You know, something I might do sometimes, depending on the song, is I will also cut around 2K if I find the drums are getting in the way of the guitar and the vocal. But it looks like I didn't feel the need to do that in this song, so I left it alone. But that's a thing I do. Here's what it sounds like without. You can hear how much it's removing the woof. It's just, it cleans up the sound quite a lot. I know a lot of people, like, there's a stigma around using these like automatic mix plugins because like, oh, it's not creative. You're not even really mixing. But like, how long have we been talking here? How long have I been talking through all the settings and tweaks and everything that I do? Like, I'm mixing. I'm just mixing into this thing that's pre-cleaned things up a bit for me so I can worry about what sounds cool and what sounds exciting rather than spending all my creative energy cleaning up the track and then having no juice left with which to make a cool, fun mix. I can focus on what matters. So then I follow that up with just, you know, a clipper, typical Todd move. Drums are peaking around -6, -5.5. I have the clipper set. This is a full-on safety clipper. It shouldn't ever go off, but if it does, it's just a little smooch. -5 decibels on the clipper, just to make absolutely sure one final time across the whole drum mix, there are no overs. So let's turn off this like preset drum chain I do, and let's listen to what it does. It comes in 2 phases. So we've got these 2 EQ moves that I showed you at the beginning of this section. That goes over the drum kit. If I have a tambourine or auxiliary percussion or reverse cymbals or some other stuff, those get their own folder. In this case, we don't have it, but that would look like this. You know, I would have like tambo, and then it would have, you know, tambourine tracks underneath it. So it would be bussing into drums perk, which is different than drum kit. So the drum perk folder without sounds like this. It's just like drums, you know, it's fine, but that sounds sick. So that's what my overall drum mix sounds like. And now I know that we have, let's delete this ghost tambo track. We've got this drum kit bus EQ. We've got this drums and percussion, batch of drum processing that is technically on a drum bus. However, I have a separate track called just drum bus. And what it's running in this song is 2 compressors. I'm running a CLA 76 or an 1176 emulation and the FBC FG Gray, which is basically an SSL bus comp from Slate. So I send the drums perk folder up into this drum bus. So with nothing on it, it just sounds like our drums. But this is a parallel bus. It runs in tandem with our overall drum mix to add just some disgusting, luscious compression. So to start things off with some aggression, I've got a CLA 76, slowest attack, fastest release, nothing we haven't seen before. It's a little over the top. And then even more compression. You can see when the snare gets hit, this meter's almost bottoming out on every snare hit. It's kind of awesome. So without any of that compression, with it, the attack of the snare is getting through. If I speed up the attack, now it sounds like a big explosive room. But with Bring Me the Horizon, their snare drum sound is really forward. So I slow the attack down to 10 rather than say 0.1, where the snare disappears. So the attack of the snare gets through, and then the whole drum kit gets squashed down. So you've got this super compressed drum kit, but with a snare that's allowed to sort of exist outside of that. I've got that blended in, turned down 12 decibels, so it's maybe like a 80-20 blend of the dry kit sound, which was this on its own, and then our hyper compressed sound, which volume adjusted is this. Which, when adjusted for volume, sounds like this. It's much quieter, but it adds this sort of pop to the snare and aggression to the cymbals and overall room sound that I find really pleasing. So let's jump over to, let's say, like the chorus. And let's listen to a little bit of it without the drum bus compression. Right? It sounds fine, but the drums are like getting a little buried by all and there's 6 guitars happening and a bunch of synths and just a whole bunch of stuff. So let's put the drum bus in the compression. That snare really jumping forward, and without it, really comes alive, really comes alive. So I do believe that's it. I don't think I missed anything. If you have any questions at all about the drum section of this mix that I just showed you, please feel free to leave a comment or message me on Discord or in the Mixer Man channel in the Discord. If you need clarification on anything, my brain isn't connected to my mouth today, so I'm kind of just rambling, but hopefully I'm making sense and making this clear for you, and you're learning something and getting inspired to some degree to get messy with your mixes. You know, especially if you start your mix, you know, with something like this, something like, you know, the Smart EQ3 across the drum bus, just cleaning up the mud for you before you even really start mixing, you can really just focus on having fun. So like I said before, this drums perk chain that I'm flipping through the effects of here, let's close this bus compressor, this sits across every drum mix that I do before I even start mixing, because I find this is a good safety net that I can fall back on. I don't have to worry about cleaning up the sound. I can just mix and have fun and do dumb stuff like boost 20 decibels of low end on the snare drum, because why not? Why not? It's already a clean and proper drum sound on the outset, so I have the chance to get a little messy. So yeah, I will stop recording for now. I will post this video, and which you already know because you're watching this. And tomorrow or the next day, we'll go over bass and guitars. But that's going to be it for me for now. This was the Duality / Bring Me the Horizon drum mix breakdown / tutorial. I feel like it's not really a tutorial. It's more of just an overview. But yeah, thank you so much for watching this and for being a member of this community. It means a lot to me to have you here, and I'll see you later. Bye.